It's only got half the screen.
A warm welcome to you all. Normally, we would all be together physically to mark this important day. However, it is fabulous that we have all come together online to mark this event. By being here together, we are renewing our pledge that the Shoah will have a permanent place in our personal and communal memories, and we pay tribute to the many victims. The fact we are here shows that we have renewed our pledge. Today, we come together to remember the terrible events of the Holocaust. It is an opportunity to remember our loss. We remember the 6 million who had their lives so cruelly taken away from them. We owe it to them that they are never forgotten. Their memories live on. We also celebrate the courage of the survivors and their families, some of whom join us today. We must ensure that these atrocities never happen again. I'd now like to conclude my introduction with the reading of the Yad Vashem law, which was an act of the Knesset in 1953. We commemorate the 6 million members of the Jewish people who died a martyr's death at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators. We commemorate the Jewish families which were wiped out by the oppressor. We commemorate the communities, synagogues, movements, and organizations, and the public, cultural, educational, religious, and benevolent institutions which were destroyed in a heinous attempt to erase the name and culture of Israel from under the skies. We commemorate the fortitude of Jews who gave their lives for their people in holiness and purity. We commemorate the heroism of Jewish servicemen and of underground fighters in towns, villages, and forests who staked their lives in the battle against the Nazi oppressor and his collaborators. We commemorate the heroic stand of the besieged and fighters of the ghettos who rose and kindled the flame of revolt to save the honor of their people. We commemorate the sublime, persistent struggle of the masses of the House of Israel on the threshold of destruction for their human dignity and Jewish culture. We commemorate the unceasing efforts of the besieged to reach Eretz Israel in spite of all obstacles, and the devotion and heroism of brothers who went forth to rescue and liberate the survivors. We commemorate the high-minded non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jews. Thank you.
In the presence of eyes which witnessed the slaughter, which saw the oppression the heart could not bear, and as witness the heart that once taught compassion until the day came to pass, the crushed human feeling, I have taken an oath to remember it all, to remember, not once to forget. Forget not one thing to the last generation when degradation shall cease, to the last to its ending, when the rod of instruction shall have come to conclusion. An oath, not in vain passed over the night of terror. An oath, not morning shall see me at flesh pots again. An oath, lest from this we learned nothing. Abraham Shlonsky. And so we begin. We begin with silence, the silence of death, the silence after destruction. There are times when song falters, when darkness fills life, when martyrdom becomes a constellation of faith against the unrelieved black of space about us. There are no words to reach beyond the edge of night, no messenger to tell the full tale. There is only silence, the silence of Hiob, the silence of 6 million, the silence of memory. Let us remember them, as we link our silence. We kindle these lights in memory of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. May the memory of the righteous be for a blessing. Zichronam livracha. We ask 3 members of our congregation and 3 members of our Jewish ethics program, JET, our post-B'nai Mitzvah program, to accompany each candle with a reading. Strong testimonies of love, hope, resilience, but also of terror and horror the authors endured and witnessed. And so I invite Maya to light for us virtually the first candle and to read her poem she chose for this evening.
The butterfly. The last, the very last, so richly, brightly and dazzlingly yellow, perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against the white stone. Such a yellow is carried lightly way up high. It went away, I'm sure, 'cause it wished to kiss the world goodbye. The 7 years I've lived here, penned up inside this ghetto, but I have found my people here. The dandelions call to me and the white chestnut candles in the court, only I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live here in the ghetto. Pavel Friedman, age 21.
Thank you. Iris will light for us the second candle.
I'm going to read a short poem by Hannah Senesh for the second candle. There are stars up above, so far away we can only see their light, long, long after the star itself is gone. And so it is with people that we loved. Their memories keep shining ever brightly, though their time with us is done. But the stars that light up the darkest night, these are the lights that guide us. As we live our days, these are the ways we remember.
Thank you very much. We have now Jaden, who will read for us her text for the third candle.
I have always been aware that there were other children who possibly wrote diaries, but never stopped to recognize even a few of those names. Knowing only of Anne Frank, it came as a surprise to me that some 60 diaries by young people have survived. Raina's diary started when she was 15 years old, 31st of January, 1939. Today, my dear diary is the beginning of our deep friendship. Who knows how long it will last? It might even continue until the end of our lives. In any case, I promise to always be honest with you. I'll be open and I'll tell you everything. She tells the diary about her first love, first kiss, and jealousies that, on looking back, are meaningless, but at the time appeared hugely important to Renia. When she and her grandparents, whom she is living with, are forced to move into the ghetto on the 15th of July, 1942, she writes, "Ghetto, that word is ringing in our ears. It terrifies, it torments. We don't know what will happen to us, where we will go, and what they'll let us take." Her boyfriend arranges for his parents and Renia to go into hiding as the Nazis liquidate the ghetto, and a few days before being caught by the Germans, she senses that the end might be coming. My dear diary, my good beloved friend, we have been through such terrible times together, and now the worst moment is upon us. I could be afraid now, but the one who didn't leave us then will help us today too. He'll save us. Hero Israel, save us, help us. The last entry in the diary is written by her boyfriend, Zygmunt, on 31st of July, 1942. 3 shots, 3 lives lost. It happened last night at 10:30 p.m. Fate decided to take away my dearest ones away from me. My life is over. All I can hear is shots, shots, shots. My dearest Renuzia, the last chapter of your diary is complete. As Deborah Lipstadt, professor of Holocaust studies, whose work led to the trial and discrediting of a notorious Holocaust denier, David Irving, which became internationally celebrated in the film Denial, writes of Renia Spiegel in Poland. She was denied with one bullet what she so wanted, a future. But for her diary, she would have gone together with millions of others into the cruel oblivion that was the fate of most Holocaust victims. Those who saved the diaries and those who worked to bring them to print have rescued them. But they could not save them from a cruel fate, nor could they give them the future they so desired. But they had rescued the young diarist's words you will hear tonight from the added pain of having been forgotten.
Thank you very much. We continue with Judith for the next candle.
It was the cold winter of 1944, in a miserable little concentration camp, grotesquely called Liberose. My father took me and some of our friends to the corner in the barracks. He announced that it was the eve of Hanukkah, produced a curious-shaped clay bowl, and began to light a wick immersed in his precious but now melted margarine ration. Before he could recite the blessing, I protested at this waste of food. He looked at me, then at the lamp, and finally said, "You and I have seen that it is possible to live up to 3 weeks without food. We once lived almost 3 days without water, but you can't live properly for 3 minutes without hope." Those are the words of Rabbi Hugo Grin. Zecher Livracha.
Thank you. I invite now Mira to read for us her text for the 5th candle.
Elsa Binder, dated January 30th, in Poland, age 17. Elsa Binder's diary reveals the struggles of a young woman exploring her identity, while all around her she witnessed death and the destruction of her community. When fear calls out in the evenings from all four corners, when the winter storm raging outside tells you it is winter, and that it is difficult to live in the winter, when my soul trembles at the sight of distant fantasies, I shiver and say one word with every heartbeat, every pulse, every piece of my soul: liberation. In such moments, it hardly matters where it is going to come from and who will bring it, so long as it's faster and comes sooner. Doubts are growing in my soul. Quiet. Blessed be he who brings good news, no matter from where, no matter to where. Time, go ahead. Time which carries liberation in its unknown tomorrow. Maybe not for me, but for people like me, the result is certain. Down with any doubts, everything comes to an end. Spring will come.
Thank you very much. And I invite now Anne Clark to read for us the poem for the 6th candle.
From Tomorrow by Motteler, a child in Terezin. From tomorrow on I shall be sad. From tomorrow on. Today I shall be happy. What is the use of sadness? Tell me that. Because those evil winds begin to blow, why should I grieve for tomorrow today? Tomorrow may be so good, so sunny. Tomorrow the sun may shine for us again. We shall no longer need to be sad. From tomorrow on I shall be sad, from tomorrow on. Not today, no, today I shall be glad. And every day, no matter how bitter it be, I shall say, From tomorrow on I shall be sad, not today.
Thank you very much. In a short moment, I will recite the El Mal Rachamim, our memorial prayer. But before that, I invite you all for a short moment of silence, a moment of reflection, a moment of peace, which we then break with the words of the El Mal Rachamim, asking God to shelter those souls in the bundle of life. El Mal Rachamim Shochen Ba'meromim Hamtzeh Menucha Nechona Tachat Anfei HaShekhinah Malot Kedushim Uterim Kezohar Hasirim Lenishmot 6,000,000 Acheinu V'Achoteinu Shemetu al Kiddush Hashem Yanuchu b'shalva u'v'shalom shelo yadu v'chayem Ana Baal harachamim Asirem beseta knafecha leholamim Utzro betzro chayim et nishmatam Adonai hu nachalatam ve'anuchu b'shalom al mishkavam ve'nomar Amen. God, full of compassion, whose presence is over us, may the souls of our 6,000,000 dead, who have gone to their everlasting home with the holy and pure on high, who shine as the lights of heaven, find the safety and rest denied to them on earth beneath the shelter of your presence. Source of mercy, cover them in the shelter of your wings forever and bind their souls into the gathering of life. It is you, God, who is the heritage. May they be at peace in their place of rest. Yizkor, we remember. Remember our people who suffered and died so that we could be free and secure. May their memory be more than a distant shadow. For their dreams left unfulfilled and lives taken too soon, we remember. Remember our brothers and sisters whose sacrifice kept the dream of democracy and justice alive. May their courage be our inspiration and our strength. For life cut short and visions unrealized, we remember. Remember the fallen of our armed services, the victims of terror and tragedy. May the darkness of their loss not obscure the light of peace. They were in love with our land and in love with life. For the agony, the tears, the mothers and the fathers, for the children who were and for the children yet to be, we remember. Please join me, if you have in front of you a Siddur, in the reading of the Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash meraba, v'alma divrach yichote, yamlich malchote, v'chai echon v'yom echon, v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, v'agala v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabba mevorach, le'alam u'lalmei almaya. Yitbarach, v'ishtabach, v'itpa'ar, v'itchomam, v'itnaseh, v'ithadar, v'itale, v'ithalal, shmei dekudesha, b'richu. Le'ela min kol bichata v'shirchata, tushbechata v'nechamata, di amiran, ve'alama v'imru, amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shamaya, v'chayim aleinu, ve'kol Yisrael, v'imru, amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'kol Yisrael, ve'kol ha'olam, v'imru, amen. May great peace from heaven and the gift of life be granted to us and to all the families of Israel and to the world, to which we say, Amen. We'll have another short piece by our choir, Psalm 121, a pilgrimage song. It says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where shall I find my help? My help is from God alone. And it concludes, God will guard your going out and your coming in now and forevermore. hand now over to Stella, who will introduce our keynote speaker for this evening.
Yes, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to those of you who haven't yet, who don't know her, Vivienne Cato. I'm sure a large number of you will remember Vivienne, who was a child of our community. She was our head teacher at Cheder for a number of years, and I also believe that she had a hand in the development of the JET program that we're running now most successfully. But I'm here not only to introduce her as a great friend of our community, who we miss greatly actually, but also as member of Generation to Generation, also known as G2G, which was formed in 2017 in order to train the children, grandchildren, and close friends of Holocaust survivors to tell the stories of their relatives or friends with a high quality and engaging presentation. I'm sure it will be. It aims to supplement but not replace the existing pool of survivors who are telling their personal story. But they recognize that for many of them, their parents or grandparents are no longer able to tell their own stories, and they feel that these vital experiences should not be forgotten. So I'm told by Leslie Urbach, I believe their chair, that their aim is to promote a clear message of tolerance and understanding for the generations of the future. It really gives me great pleasure to invite Vivienne to tell us more of the story of her mother, Eva Cato, whom I'm sure a large number of you will remember. Over to you, Vivienne. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella, for that lovely introduction. It's very moving for me to be speaking to my old synagogue and, of course, my mother's old synagogue, where she was a member for 50 years plus. This is really a unique occasion to be doing this talk. Thank you. I'm just going to share. Sorry, just slideshow. Okay. I hope you can all see that. All right. So the title of my presentation is Faraway Country, Faraway Time. Many of you will recognize this as a reference to Neville Chamberlain, who was Britain's Prime Minister in the run-up to World War II. He was referring to Czechoslovakia as a faraway country of which we know nothing. That is, somewhere not really worth going to war over. As for the time, the story I'm about to tell you takes place in the 1930s and the 1940s. And to me, neither the time nor the place feel very far away at all. Don't follow. These two words scrawled onto a cigarette packet, like this one, saved my mother's life. We'll find out how later on. First, a bit of background. This is a map of Europe from before World War II. You can see Czechoslovakia in the middle. That's where my mother was born. And of course, it was a very young country. It had only been created in 1918, after the Second World War. As we know, the Holocaust was the attempted genocide of all Europe's Jews. And you can see on this map of Europe all the countries, those in blue, in which the Nazis murdered not only Jews, but other opponents, so-called opponents, gay people, Roma, the disabled. And of course, the source of that disaster was this man, and I don't need to tell this audience any more about him than that. So, the pre-war period, and back to my mother's story. My mother, Eva, was born in 1926 in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. At the time of her birth, there were about 135,000 Jews living in Slovakia. Many of them had been there for generations, living fairly safely amongst the Christian population. And here are some members of the family into which she was born: parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. They were ordinary Slovak citizens who just happened to be Jewish. Here is a better picture of her Mother Clara, who one or two of you may even remember, and her father, Ignaz, whom you won't. When Eva was 5, her parents decided to separate. Her father, my grandfather, who was a doctor, got one of 200 visas that Britain was offering to Czech Jewish doctors so they could get out of Nazi Europe. 5-year-old Eva and her mother moved to Brezno in the center of the country. That's where her grandparents and her Aunt Margit were living. And there they are. Her grandparents on the left 2 pictures, her aunt in the dark blouse. There were only a few hundred Jews in Brezno, and they were mostly accepted by the Christian majority. In 1993, my mother was interviewed for a Holocaust testimony project. The clips of her that you will see through this presentation are taken from that recording. Eva's family were all Jewish, but like most of the Jewish community in her town, they were not very observant.
My mother always lit the Shabbat candles. We fasted on Yom Kippur, went to synagogue on high holidays, occasionally on the Shabbat morning. My grandfather became religious in his very old age. Then he turned and read the Bible and spent his time looking at prayer books and so on, but then he was over 80. My grandmother was absolutely irreligious. She came from Brno, and she was a French teacher in her youth, and she absolutely didn't do anything for Judaism. I mean, wasn't religious at all.
Of course, anti-Semitism was nothing new in Central Europe. My mother told me that she remembered some anti-Semitic name-calling from other children in the town, but at that time there was not a lot of hostility to Jews. No one in the town's Jewish community took Hitler seriously or could imagine what was coming.
Oh yes, but I think in the beginning nobody took it seriously. That anything like what happened could come out of him. I mean, he was taken as an extremist, as somebody not quite there, not quite normal, and nothing will happen.
Even though graffiti like this did not, as far as Eva remembered, appear in her town, they did in many other places in Czechoslovakia. Those images from before the war that show nasty, hostile caricatures of Jews are sadly still circulating around the world today in books and on social media. In the autumn of 1938, my mother was 12 and starting what here we call Year 8.
In the second year of the secondary school, I was thrown out. I mean, all the Jews were thrown out of school. And as I wasn't 14 yet, and the compulsory age was until 14, a Jewish school was formed for us. But in Brezno, there were few Jewish children. In my class, there were perhaps 3 or 4. So that school was formed with different age groups. And we were very lucky to have a very good teacher who lately went to Israel and who was in Brezno because of Hakshara, which was a preparation to go to Israel. And she took it very seriously, and she did a lot of work with us. But after that, after 14, I couldn't go to school anymore. And with 15, I went to Hungary. So that I missed a lot of school years or school or education.
So how else was life changing for Jews in Slovakia? Well, in Germany in 1935, Hitler had brought in the Nuremberg laws. These removed German citizenship and voting rights from Jews and forbade them to marry someone non-Jewish. In 1938, the Nazis had occupied the Czech Sudetenland, which had a large German population, and they had absorbed it into their empire. Slovakia remained technically independent, but was sympathetic to the Nazis. So Slovakia, in effect, became a puppet state of Germany's. As you know, on the 1st September 1939, German troops invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war on Germany, and the Second World War was underway. Slovakia brought in its own version of the Nuremberg laws in September 1941. It contained 270 regulations that were designed to turn the Jews of Slovakia into second-class citizens. It was known as the Jewish Code. And now we come to the central part of this story, wartime. How did life change for Slovakian Jews with the start of the war?
Every week there was more or less a different rule to say, first of all the Jews have to hand in all the sports equipment. I had a new pair of skis and I was very keen on them, and I had to go and take their photographic equipment, jewelry. Then you had a certain date by which you had to give in all the jewelry, and somebody came to collect it, and my mother gave more or less all she had. And then the man looked at her and says, "And now your wedding ring." And that hurt her very much, that even that they needed not even a wedding ring, but they leave. And all different things. Now you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, you mustn't live on the facing the main road. You have to have a flat or a house in a side street. And that's how we got into a very miserable flat, because we had to leave ours. And then it continued. I don't know, I think in Hungary it didn't go like this by stages, but always in Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, always something more they wanted. Now you have to give in money from the bank, and all these rules came out, and you couldn't do anything about it.
Nothing life-threatening happened for Jews in Slovakia for 2.5 years, despite it being wartime. The Jewish Code continued to restrict their lives, but it wasn't until March 1942 that the Slovak government started to deport Jews to Auschwitz. As you know, Auschwitz was the largest and most notorious of the Nazi death camps and concentration camps, and 1.1 million Jews from all over Europe were killed there. Over only a few months, 57,000 Jews from Slovakia were deported to Auschwitz. Only a few hundred survived.
Expected everybody to obey rules. So people didn't think at that time that they can do something about it, as to revolt or fight back or not take orders. So the people nicely with their belongings, rucksacks and everything assembled. I don't know where they had to assemble, in the town hall or somewhere, or the station, I can't remember. But most of these people went. And as I say, at the first transport, nobody thought that they're really going to be death camps.
The first group of people that they came for was unmarried women. Unfortunately, my great-aunt Margit was one such. Along with 1,000 others from across Slovakia, she was taken away in spring 1942 and died in Auschwitz a few weeks later, at the age of 37. And here is the story of the cigarette packet.
And as she wasn't married, she was obliged to go.
Was your aunt able to communicate at all with you after she was deported?
Yes, she was taken to Auschwitz, but on the way, a certain distance, they went by normal in normal railway carriages, and I suppose from there, she was a smoker, and from there she threw out a cigarette box with my mother's address, and just a message, "Don't follow," and somebody picked it up and very decently posted it to us. That was a miracle. Nobody heard anything from these people who left, that we heard at least before she got to Auschwitz. And she never came back, of course.
Do you remember when your family received this message?
Yes, because that was so unbelievable. First we thought it's somebody made a joke or something, and then they recognized her writing and the cigarette brand which she used to smoke and so on, and it was genuine, but nobody put a note to it or anything. It was just put in an envelope and posted. And that was the very last we heard of her.
This heroic warning from Margit saved their lives. My grandmother took the difficult decision to leave her elderly parents behind and escape with my mother to Hungary.
My mother was thinking about it very thoroughly what to do. And then she decided we go to Hungary. My aunt, another aunt who was married to a solicitor very near the border, sent a message that they can get us across. So in the middle of the night, we met somebody who said this and this man sent him, but we didn't see him, we didn't see them, or we didn't know anything about them. So it was really dangerous, and just to go and walk across, I mean, we walked perhaps 2 or 3 hours. And when we got to the border, one of them said, well, can you hear something? No, because I don't hear. And the other one, 5 minutes later, said, can you see something? So, no, there's nothing to be seen, because my eyesight is not very good. And people like this, we were supposed to trust and get across, but they did take us across.
And what a difficult journey that must have been, physically tough, but also so much anxiety. How could they trust these strangers to take them across the border and not betray them? So why did they go to Hungary? Well, from where they were, it was the nearest country to get to. And Hungary was quite hostile to Jews. In 1938, 4 years earlier, it had brought in anti-Jewish legislation, rather like in Slovakia. But although these laws caused many hardships, in 1942, most of the Jews of Hungary were still living in relative safety. But even once they'd crossed the border and arrived at an aunt's house, their situation remained dangerous. They were immediately at risk of being spotted as Nazi sympathizers, spotted as Jewish refugees and betrayed to Nazi sympathizers.
It was early morning by the time we got to Lučenec, which is practically a border town, used to belong to Slovakia and at that time was Hungary. And my aunt, another aunt, lived there with her husband, who arranged for this transport, for this crossing. And early in the morning, when we came down, the maid said good morning to me, and I said good morning in Hungarian, my non-existent Hungarian. And she went and told the police that there are people who escaped from Czechoslovakia staying with her boss. Luckily, my uncle had somebody in the police who came to tell him about it. So we spent the whole day, the whole afternoon in the cinema. In the morning we were walking, so not to be there when they came to collect us. That was a horrible day. And because there was no train to Budapest, all in the evening. Or the train which they wanted us to come was all in the evening. Anyway, we spent the whole day wandering and being in the cinema, not remembering anything about it, just to sit there.
And that was one of those life-changing moments that all survivors necessarily share, where your life could have turned and ended on a hair's breadth. So here started 3 years of living under a false identity when they got to Budapest. One of my mother's uncles knew a priest who had managed to obtain for them fake identity cards he had bought from a non-Jewish single mother and her teenage daughter. My mother was 15 when they arrived in Budapest.
No, they didn't know who we are. We had papers. And I don't remember what was the excuse why we came from this little place in Hungary, which my mother had papers. I mean, we had papers, where she was an unmarried mother with a daughter. And they were genuine papers. But I always said they're good only as long as I'm not asked to show them, because I was terrified. I was terrified of being asked and being asked further questions. My nightmare was that I asked for the Lord's Prayer to say it in Hungarian, and I tried to learn it, but it wasn't all that easy. So they were okay, these papers were okay, but I always said if my mother gets asked or I get asked, that will be the end. Many people were caught in Hungary who were hiding there.
So for the next 3 years, my mother and her mother lived in Budapest in a series of increasingly dangerous situations. From time to time, they worked undercover and at great risk in jobs such as assistant to the hat shop to get some money. Increasingly often, they had to move accommodation to avoid betrayal. So a little bit of history, just to give an idea of quite how dangerous the situation became for them soon after they arrived. In 1942 to 1943, Hungary started to pull out of its alliance with Germany. This was not acceptable to the Nazis, and in March 1944, German troops invaded Hungary. Acting swiftly, in just over 3 months, the Nazis deported 430,000 Hungarian Jews from all over the country. That's the equivalent of 53,000 a day. They were sent mostly to Auschwitz, where most were gassed on arrival. In October 1944, the new and even more vicious Hungarian government introduced a reign of terror in Budapest. Nearly 80,000 Jews were killed in the city itself, shot into the Danube, as you see on the right, my great uncle among them. The Jews of Budapest were the last remaining Jewish community in Europe. This picture shows the memorial that is now by the river in Budapest. The shoes represent those who were shot there. At the turn of the year, 1944 to 45, the Russians, Britain's allies, encircled Budapest, and the final battle for the city took place. This became known as the Siege of Budapest. During this time, many more thousands died from starvation, cold, disease, and military action. Sorry. I'm going to show a short film that I found on the internet, which gives you it's footage from the city at the time of the siege. It's there for the images only. Don't worry about the Hungarian words spoken. Oh.
És szent akarattal küzdünk a győzelmes békéért, amely újra elhozza a csillogó karácsonyok hosszú sorát.
So my mother is now going to talk about her experience of the Siege of Budapest and the end of the war.
It was getting dark and we were in a great need to find somewhere to go, and then my mother suddenly thought if she rings up the boss's wife, she might agree that we spend the time in the shelter. And she did, and we just walked in saying, well, my mother works in the shop and we will spend, I think at the beginning we said only a short while, but on the end we were there from Christmas Eve till January the 12th, when the Russians came in and we were liberated. So we had nothing. And on the beginning, I don't even know how. So occasionally one could get bread. Opposite was a bakery, and somebody came to say the bakery is open, and I went over and queued up and got us bread. And then came the time when bread wasn't available, and so different black marketeers entered the shelters, and once they came and were selling sultanas, and we bought some. And for about, I don't know, 2 weeks or something, we had nothing but sultanas. And it was awful for breakfast, for lunch. And afterwards, for years, I couldn't look at a raisin or sultana. And somehow we survived. Then, as soon as the Russians came in, one could leave the shelter. But by that time, nothing was available. No food, no shops were open.
I'm just going to cut that a little bit short. She now talks particularly about being liberated by the Russian army.
It was a marvelous feeling because partly that we could speak to them, partly we knew that the Germans have left and it can't take long to the end of the world, of course. Nobody misbehaved with us. There where we were in the countryside, there were some Russian stationed officers, and to one we said something that we are Jewish, and he said, so am I. And then he came the next day with a parcel, food parcel, and he said, wenn Sie sich nicht beleidigen, which means if you are not offended. I brought you something, but please don't be offended that I give you food like this. So it was marvelous. I mean, we always said if the Russians wouldn't have come in when they did, we probably wouldn't be here.
My mother was always grateful to the Russians for liberating them. They had been lucky. More than 80% of the Slovak Jewish population that existed before the war had been murdered. And on this table, you can see more of the awful statistics. These are just some of the countries in which Jews were murdered in Europe. It includes obviously Poland, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, but others too. The central column gives you the raw figures of the numbers murdered. And on the right, you can see the percentages of each country's Jewish population that were killed. Some of them quite mind-blowingly enormous. And of course, there were many other victims of the Nazis too, as I mentioned before, at least 1.5 million others. And here are the members of the family that I showed you earlier and what happened to them. Those with the Red Cross did not survive. They were killed. They include my great-grandparents on the far left, up and down, Aunt Margaret, great-aunt Margaret for me in the middle with the black blouse, and at the top of the middle, Aurel, who was the uncle shot into the Danube. So a few words about after the war. So after the war, my mother was 18, and she and her mother made their way back home to Breslau, but found that all the remaining family and their friends were no longer there. They had been also taken away and murdered by the Nazis. Eva had missed years 8 to 13, as we call it, of school because of Hitler, and she always resented that. After the war, she got a chance to catch up with a 1-year crash course in secondary education, and then she got a place in medical school to become a doctor.
I became a medical student.
At which university?
In Bratislava, there was only one university. And studied for 2 years in reality, 2.5 years on paper, because the last half year was spent with trying to get out and trying to get the papers and everything, because then I already knew that it's impossible, especially for me to remain in Slovakia and study, because I don't know how you call it, cadre, I had a bad description or something, official description, because I had a father who partly was a doctor, which brought him up to upper class or upper middle class. And secondly, because he was living in Britain. So they wouldn't have let me finish anyway. And then the opportunity came to come out, and I did come to England in 1949.
So after less than 2 years in medical school, she once again, her life was changed once again because the communist regime could not tolerate her middle class status and the fact that her father had so-called betrayed the country by leaving. So in 1949, they immigrated to London, where my grandfather was still living. My grandmother worked as a corset maker for some years after the war, and my mother, here aged about 24, worked first as a dress cutter and then as a bookkeeper. Sadly, she was unable to resume her medical studies, and so she never achieved her dream of becoming a doctor. In 1953, she married my father, George Cato, who some of you may also remember. And in 1961, they moved to Wimbledon and joined Wimbledon Synagogue, which was then only 9 years old. They had a baby girl, fortunately for me. That's me. There they are in the 1970s, perhaps as some people remember them. And Eva finally became a grandmother. In 1997, I took my mother back to her hometown, to Brezno, and to Czechoslovakia on a trip back home. It was the first time she had been back to Slovakia since leaving in 1949. And as it happened, the time was unknown to me, obviously very fortuitous, because only 3 months later, she was disabled by a stroke that put her in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. There she is on the corner of their street, which we found very easily, just off the main square. And quite amazingly, the apartment block in which she lived with her grandparents still exists. And there she is at the back, showing the balcony. The synagogue still exists. It's not operational as a synagogue, of course, but it is still there. So before the war, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had called Czechoslovakia a faraway country of which we know nothing. But now, when the planes are flying, it's just 2 hours away in an aeroplane. And we're lucky to have Czechs, Slovaks, and people from all around the world living with us here in the UK. But sadly, despite this, we still have racism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. The history of the Holocaust should teach us that hostility to people who are not like us can end very badly indeed, and that instead we should all be working towards a society that is open, welcoming, and equal, so that this terrible piece of human history should not have been for nothing. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this indeed very moving testimony of your mother's life. Unfortunately, I'm not one of the members of the synagogue who had the pleasure to meet her and to listen to her testimony directly from her. But I think you did a terrific job by bringing her life visually alive in front of our eyes by sharing also this wonderful documents of your family. We have some time for questions, thoughts from the audience. So if someone would like to ask something, please either put that into the chat or unmute yourself and ask your question. So perhaps I can just break a little bit the silence by asking, so when did you learn about the story of your mother and your family? Was there a time of silence? Was this a dark history for you, or when did your mother open up to share?
Well, I can't remember a time when I first knew that my family had been in the Holocaust. My father came in before the war, so his experience was different, but the Holocaust experience was always there in some sense. I mean, my grandmother who lived with us would wake at night screaming often, and it was because of her experiences of losing many siblings. So I never didn't know. However, my mother was not very willing to talk, or there was definitely a sense of you don't really ask questions, or I would ask a question and she would say, you know that story, which I didn't necessarily. When this recording was made, I was extremely grateful that the story had been captured like that, because I felt that she would not have told me all those stories myself. And I was extremely grateful to Yale University and the British Library in that interview in particular for capturing it. So that's how it was really. It was there but not there, I think you could say.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask if other children of survivors actually found the same thing, that it was there, but you never actually got the full story. Is that what happened to you as well?
Yes. I mean, my experience talking to other second generation people is that kind of secrecy was very common, and that the children felt that they couldn't ask anything. They were aware of something, but they were not supposed to ask. Or some families had the opposite experience, where the survivor just couldn't stop talking about their lives during the war compulsively, and it was just the opposite experience. I suspect that's the rarer way round, but it seems to be one of two extremes.
Yeah. I remember Ziggy Quick telling her story once at a ladies' guild, and it was quite electrifying, and I think electrifying for everybody around her who hadn't heard the story as well. She was on one of the death marches.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there are many stories, and in generation there are now coming up. Well, what's the figure? It's about coming up to 20 presentations in the bag, including mine, and more to come. And we now have some third generation speakers as well. So if any of you, by the way, have other networks who you think would appreciate having one of our speakers, doesn't have to be me, please do just get in touch with us through the website. And there's a whole range of experiences, some of which are more suitable for young people than others. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, so there is, of course, invitation to look on the website of Generation to Generation. We as a community will for sure will use the opportunity once again also to get a speaker through them. I think it's a wonderful idea of them to help and to facilitate presenting the testimonies, especially now through Zoom and the other technology we have at hand. If there are no further questions from the audience, I would like once again to thank foremost, of course, Vivienne for her excellent talk and the presentation, and also thank you to Generation for helping her to set this up and to organizing for us this evening, or help us to organize this evening of commemoration. Thank you to our choir, and we will have one final piece from the choir at the end of this evening, to Rob for opening the evening. A special thank you to Alex Habel for teaching and supporting our JET students, and to help them preparing their readings for this evening. Then thank you to Maya Awes, Iris Friedler, Jaden Kane, Judith Ish-Horowitz, Mira Levy, and Anne Clark for lighting the candles, or to accompany our candles this evening. And thank you to Stella Mason for introducing our keynote speaker. Before I will conclude the service by thanking every one of you who joined us this evening, also on YouTube, I want to do one of our religious obligations as we are on our journey from Pesach towards Shavuot, and we do that by counting each evening the Omer, one step towards the idea of really a true freedom through understanding, freedom through really taking ownership of liberation, of the liberation and of freedom and of knowledge. So we count the 12th day, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al tzfirat ha'omer hayom 12 yom shehem shavua echad v'chamisha yamim la'omer. Today is the 12th day on our journey in the Omer time. And so we remember, and by remembering we keep alive. In the rising of the sun and its going down, we remember them. In the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we remember them. In the opening of buds and the rebirth of spring, we remember them. In the blueness of sky and in the warmth of summer, we remember them. In the rustling of leaves and the beauty of autumn, we remember them. In the beginning of the year, and when it ends, we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember them. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember them. When we remember them. So long as we live, they too shall live, for they are a part of us as we remember them.